A significant development has emerged in the ongoing scrutiny of the Trump administration's Department of Justice, centered on a social media post that administration officials confirmed was intended as a private communication between the president and his attorney general.
Breaking news away from the conflict now. U.S. President Donald Trump has fired his Attorney General Pam Bondi. Let's go to Washington. Our chief U.S. correspondent, Alan Fisher, is there. How much of a surprise is this, Alan?
It's been coming. We've heard a lot of talk over the last week or so that Donald Trump was unhappy with her performance. He likes her personally, but just felt she wasn't on delivering on a lot of his views and vision. She ran into problems, of course, with the Epstein files. You remember that she said that she had a list of contacts that Jeffrey Epstein had on her desk, and she was going to release them. And then the FBI, which comes under Bondi's control, was forced to put out a statement saying there was actually no list. That didn't work well with Donald Trump, and she defended him very vigorously at hearings on Capitol Hill. Certainly was very vocal in her defense of the president.
In what officials described as an accidental public posting, President Donald Trump shared on Truth Social a message that was meant for Attorney General Pam Bondi personally. The message expressed frustration that legal action had not been taken against several named individuals, including former FBI Director James Comey, Senator Adam Schiff, and New York Attorney General Letitia James. An administration official confirmed to NBC News that the president had intended the communication for Bondi privately and was surprised by its public visibility. The confirmation by administration officials that the message was intended as a private directive rather than a public statement carries substantial evidentiary weight. Rather than disputing the content or denying that such direction occurred, the administration's explanation acknowledged the private nature of the communication and the president's intent to direct the attorney general regarding specific prosecutorial targets.
That breaking news, President Trump's termination of Attorney General Pam Bondi, his second cabinet shakeup in a month. Bondi is a longtime Trump loyalist who helped defend him in his first impeachment trial. Just yesterday, she was seen accompanying him to the Supreme Court for those arguments on birthright citizenship. But the president had reportedly grown impatient with Bondi's lack of success in prosecuting his enemies and her PR blunders on the Epstein case, including a combative hearing on Capitol Hill. But Pam Bondi leaves the Department of Justice more firmly under his control. ABC's Chief Justice correspondent Pierre Thomas leads us off.
Despite being perhaps the most loyal attorney general in recent history, Pam Bondi is out.
President Trump, the greatest president in American history. President Trump is the most transparent president in American history.
Today, President Trump posting on social media that Bondi, whom he called a friend and an American patriot, will be transitioning to a much-needed and important new job in the private sector. Bondi and Trump seen.
Legal scholars note that the distinction between public political commentary and private instructions to law enforcement officials is significant. Public statements about enforcement priorities can be interpreted as political rhetoric or expressions of preference. Private communications to the nation's chief law enforcement officer, by contrast, carry the weight of directive authority and establish a documented chain of political influence over prosecutorial decisions. The individuals named in the message share a common characteristic. Each has been a prominent political adversary of the president. James Comey, whom Trump dismissed as FBI director in 2017, has been a consistent critic of the administration. Adam Schiff served as chairman of the House Intelligence Committee during the first impeachment proceedings and was a leading figure in those investigations. Letitia James brought the civil fraud case that resulted in a substantial judgment against the Trump Organization. The specificity of these names, combined with the personal nature of the communication, has drawn attention from constitutional scholars who study the boundaries between political authority and prosecutorial independence. Pam Bondi's background and relationship with the president add context to the nature of this communication. A former Florida Attorney General, Bondi defended Trump during his first impeachment trial and has maintained a close political alliance with him throughout his political career. Her appointment as Attorney General was widely viewed as placing a longtime loyalist in charge of the Department of Justice, an institution that traditionally maintains operational independence from direct political direction. The accidental disclosure has generated significant discussion among legal observers because of how the evidence emerged. Unlike information obtained through investigative reporting, whistleblower disclosures, or surveillance, this documentation of presidential direction originated from the president's own social media account and was confirmed by his own administration. This self-generated evidence, scholars argue, removes many of the evidentiary disputes that typically accompany allegations of political interference in law enforcement. The incident also occurs within a broader pattern of conduct during Bondi's tenure that has drawn scrutiny from government accountability organizations. These include her handling of documents related to the Jeffrey Epstein investigation, her testimony before congressional committees, and specific policy changes implemented at the Department of Justice. One such policy change involves the rollback of protections for journalistic sources established during the previous administration. The Biden administration had implemented guidelines generally prohibiting the Department of Justice from seeking subpoenas, court orders, and search warrants for journalist communications records in leak investigations. Bondi's memorandum reversed these protections, restoring the department's ability to use legal process to pursue journalist records in cases involving leaks and national security matters. The justification provided for this policy change centered on protecting classified information and preventing unauthorized disclosures. However, critics have noted that the restoration of these investigative tools, occurring concurrently with documented presidential direction to pursue political adversaries, creates a concerning alignment between political targeting and the mechanisms available to investigate those who report on such targeting. The relationship between these two developments, the private direction to pursue political opponents and the expanded legal tools to investigate journalists, has been described by press freedom advocates as particularly troubling. When political direction identifies specific targets and policy changes expand the capacity to investigate reporters covering those targets, the combined effect creates what advocates characterize as a restrictive environment for accountability journalism. The handling of Senate toll records during Bondi's testimony has also drawn analytical attention. During hearings, Republican senators characterized investigative activities as tapping of phones in connection with investigations into efforts to overturn the 2020 election. The underlying documentation, however, indicated that investigators conducted toll analysis, examination of metadata showing who called whom, when, and for what duration, rather than audio wiretaps capturing conversation content. Toll analysis operates under different legal standards than full wiretap authorization and does not produce recordings of communications. Bondi's decision not to correct the characterization of toll analysis as phone tapping during her testimony, despite the legal distinction between these investigative methods, has been noted by observers as an instance where technical accuracy was not provided in a politically charged setting. The combination of these elements, the accidentally disclosed private message, the policy rollback of journalistic protections, and the testimony regarding investigative methods, forms what legal analysts describe as a comprehensive picture of the Department of Justice's operational alignment with political direction during this period. The documented record of President Trump's communication with Attorney General Bondi raises fundamental questions about the independence of federal law enforcement and the institutional safeguards that maintain separation between political authority and prosecutorial decision-making. The Department of Justice's operational independence from direct presidential control over individual prosecutorial decisions represents a foundational principle of American governance. This independence ensures that prosecutorial determinations, whether to charge, to decline prosecution, or to pursue specific investigative avenues, are based on evidence and applicable law rather than political considerations. When this independence is perceived to be compromised, the credibility of federal law enforcement outcomes becomes subject to question, regardless of the ultimate disposition of any individual case. The accidentally public message, confirmed by administration officials as an intended private directive, establishes documentation of the type of direct political influence that the institutional structure of the Department of Justice is designed to prevent. The confirmation that this was meant as private instruction rather than public rhetoric removes the interpretive framework that might otherwise characterize such communications as political speech rather than operational direction. Constitutional scholars emphasize that the specific combination present in this situation, maximum demonstrated loyalty from the Attorney General, maximum institutional authority through the Department of Justice, and explicit direction to use that authority against named political opponents, represents the configuration most concerning for the integrity of federal law enforcement. The individuals named in the President's message, Comey, Schiff, and James, are not subjects of publicly known pending federal investigations unrelated to their political conflicts with the President. Rather, their common characteristic is their documented history of political and legal opposition to Trump. The direction to pursue legal action against these specific individuals, communicated privately to the Attorney General, has been characterized by legal analysts as aligning precisely with definitions of weaponizing law enforcement for political purposes. The administration's response to the accidental disclosure has itself become a subject of analytical focus. Rather than denying that the President was directing the Attorney General to pursue political adversaries, the administration confirmed that this was precisely the nature of the communication and explained only that its public visibility was unintended. This confirmation, coming from the administration itself rather than from investigative journalists or opposition sources, carries particular evidentiary significance. Some arguments have been advanced that the message represented personal frustration rather than formal prosecutorial directive, and that presidents commonly express views about enforcement without such expressions constituting illegal orders. However, legal scholars counter that the administration's own confirmation of the message's private, intended nature distinguishes this communication from public political commentary. Private instructions to law enforcement officials occupy a different category than public statements about preferred policy outcomes. Additionally, the argument that the named individuals may have legitimate legal exposure does not address the core concern. The President's personal political grievances against these individuals are well documented, and the direction to pursue them came through private channels rather than through established processes for reviewing potential prosecutorial matters. The combination of personal political context, specific named targets, and private directorial communication creates the precise circumstances that accountability mechanisms are designed to prevent. The journalist protection rollback implemented under Bondi's leadership adds a further dimension to these concerns. When political direction identifies specific targets for law enforcement attention and simultaneous policy changes expand the department's capacity to pursue the sources of reporting about those targets, the interaction between these policies creates what press freedom organizations describe as a compounded threat to accountability journalism. The traditional role of investigative reporting in documenting government conduct relies on sources within government being willing to share information with journalists. When legal mechanisms to pursue those sources are expanded, and when the subjects of reporting are simultaneously identified as targets for law enforcement action, the environment for obtaining and publishing information about government operations becomes more restrictive. The long-term institutional significance of these developments extends beyond any individual prosecution or investigation. The credibility of the Department of Justice depends on public confidence that its decisions reflect legal and evidentiary considerations rather than political direction. When documentation emerges, particularly self-generated documentation, confirmed by the administration itself, that the President is privately directing the Attorney General regarding specific prosecutorial targets, that credibility is affected in ways that persist regardless of subsequent developments. Accountability advocates have noted that the evidence in this situation emerged not through covert surveillance or investigative leaks, but through the President's own social media activity and the administration's explanation of that activity. This origin makes the evidence difficult to dispute through typical means of challenging investigative sources or questioning the motivations of those who disclosed information. The full picture of the Department of Justice's operations during this period, encompassing the accidentally disclosed message, the policy changes regarding journalistic sources, the handling of congressional testimony, and the management of specific investigations, presents what legal observers describe as an unprecedented alignment between political interests and prosecutorial direction in modern American governance. The question of restoring Department of Justice independence after such documented alignment represents a significant challenge for institutional accountability. The damage to perceived independence, scholars note, occurs when the documentation of political direction becomes credible, and that credibility has been established through the administration's own confirmation of the private nature and intended recipient of the president's communication. As these developments continue to unfold, the institutional response, whether through congressional oversight, judicial review, or internal departmental mechanisms, will determine the extent to which the traditional separation between political authority and prosecutorial independence can be maintained or restored. The documentation currently available, originating from the administration's own records and confirmed by its own officials, establishes a factual foundation for these accountability processes that differs from typical allegations of improper political influence in its self-generating nature. The ongoing examination of these matters by legal scholars, government accountability organizations, and institutional oversight bodies will continue to assess the full implications of this documented pattern for the operation of federal law enforcement and the constitutional principles that govern the relationship between political leadership and prosecutorial authority.